everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Climate Conundrum Podcast. I am Sanika Diwanji, and today we're discussing about carbon markets. This topic keeps coming up in the news, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard about it, read about it, the recent Google example, or what's happening in different countries. There's a lot of examples to choose from. But then when you start digging in, you realize that not everyone is really aware of what it really means, all the nuances. And that's why I have a very special guest here to explain the basics to us. Please welcome Sandeep Roy Choudhury. He's the director of BNB Advisory Services and an expert on carbon markets. He works on this on a daily basis. So I think he's the perfect person to introduce these topics to us. Hi, Sandeep.
Thanks, Sanika, and it's lovely to be here. Just as I'm Sandeep, I lead an organization called VNV, as you said, Sanika. But I have been spending about 17 to 18 years in larger climate finance, but private sector climate finance, and which is where carbon markets is kind of derived from. So a lot of you might have heard about, different kinds of campaigns of polluters pay principles, of loss and damage. Maybe these are terms that you might have heard in the news and the works. But so carbon markets for me became quite an obsession and about 15, 16 years back, where I realized that this is a very good way to finance a lot of the transition that we keep talking about in climate change. So yeah, I mean, spending all those years. Before that, I was in human resources, which was very boring after a point, to be honest. With all due respect to all of the HR professionals out there, so this was a nice way to work on something that was going to affect us all. I mean, it's been 15 years, but we see every year being the worse than the year before. So yeah, really looking forward to this conversation, Sanika.
I'm so glad we're doing this, and no one better, I feel, than someone who actually works in this field and with the breadth of experience that you have. Obviously, my first question is going to be, what is carbon markets? What exactly were they created? What is the story?
Well, I mean, the story is, I think in the late 90s, there was this whole movement around, how will we finance the decarbonization that we're talking about? And when I say decarbonization, today, global warming is happening because of excess carbon in the atmosphere. So how do we reduce this? And when we started digging into how do we reduce this, firstly, the house, and then who's going to pay for it, right? There was this whole host of UN mechanisms that came in where the developed world was going to support the developing world, because the historical emissions that have been already released into the air by the industrialized nations is actually making a lot of the non-industrialized nations, or right now growing economies, in a spot of bother. Because we when I say we, a lot of us in the global south did not really create this problem that we have today. So there was this whole movement of, okay, who pays for it? So if you were asking emerging economies to decarbonize, then somebody had to pay for it. And that's how these mechanisms started taking shape. I mean, we had these different kinds of climate finance mechanisms, different climate loans to governments from the US and Europe to Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia. And that's where I think some of this work started moving towards, okay, so what can companies do to help? And that's where we first came up with the Kyoto Protocol, which was kind of a protocol that was signed with different countries, who said, listen, we can quantify the tonnage of carbon that every company emits. And if they emit beyond a certain limit, then they should be funding an emission reduction cut, which is exactly commensurate to the same emission reduction here somewhere else. That was also a way for companies in the developed countries paying for decarbonization in developing countries. And that's where the genesis of carbon markets came up. So carbon markets was very simple. I am allowed, as maybe a steel company in the UK, I'm allowed to emit 100 tons. That's my cap. If I emit 120 tons, then for compliance reasons, I would have to buy another 20 tons from somebody else, somewhere else in the world. Now, a lot of people did not understand. They said, why is this happening? But this was very important to be done, because otherwise there would be no decarbonization in countries like India and China. When I
Mm.
say no, it would be much slower because nobody is going to pay for it. Because we also need the chance to grow, right? But we need to grow sustainably. In that sense, there is always somebody has to pick up the bill. And that was facilitated by this whole carbon thing with the Kyoto Protocol. And once the Kyoto Protocol kind of went into force, there were companies who were not under the cap and trade, how we call it cap and trade.
Mhm.
Cap is your 100, going back to my earlier
Right.
example.
Yeah.
And then you can trade, that is, you can buy the 20 tons. And then a lot of companies said, listen, we want to do this voluntarily. We want to also pitch in. And that's where the whole voluntary carbon market. So the carbon markets has two sections to it, a compliance part, which is the cap and trade mechanisms, which is very, very important for the world to decarbonize. And then you have the
Mhm.
voluntary carbon market, which is basically a corporate which out of the responsibility that they should be taking from the developed countries supports emission reductions or avoidances in developing countries. And a ton of CO2 saved is a carbon credit, which is certified by a third party. And that's the carbon credit, which is sold, in some cases traded. When you sell, trade, finance, it becomes the markets. That's your carbon market.
That's very informative. I think it's also very easy to now understand that, okay, well, you want to help like global south. I don't like using that word particularly, but it is what it is. Um, Countries that need to decarbonize that don't have the funding will be helped in this market by anyone who's willing to invest. It's almost like an investment, right? Or am I
It
using the
is.
word wrong?
No, I mean, it is. I mean, okay, so we use the whole word responsibility. I was like, okay, listen, if you're a company right now, your emissions are not zero today, and it will not be zero tomorrow either. I mean, as much as we would like to live in an ideal world, that's not going to happen, right? I mean, and I would love to just stop oil tomorrow, but it's not going to happen. So if it does not happen, this company is still going to emit a few tons out there, right? Because they're going to take a flight, maybe they're transporting their goods using a ship, which is right now not electrified or running on diesel. There is an emission. So either a company does something about it, because if they don't, it's fine. I mean, today we will go and campaign saying that, no, no, please reduce your emissions. But what about the already emitted ones? They will
Absolutely.
reduce tomorrow. So what happens today? So we said, okay, this is a great way. And I wouldn't call it help so much, Sanika. I would say finance the transition. It is
Right.
important to finance the transition. The big hubs of emissions in the future are going to be India and China, and so because then what happens if we do not finance the transition now, we're still going to have global warming as a bigger problem. It's not. And that's the thing about carbon markets, because it actually, I think, reinforces the idea that reducing emissions is a global problem. It is not a local problem.
Mhm.
So if you are reducing your emissions completely to zero, you cleaned your house up, but if you didn't help somebody else clean their house up, you still have a problem. And that
Absolutely.
is where the carbon markets, I think, are an essential part of the climate change solution.
So from the Kyoto Protocol in 1996, I believe,
Mhm.
we came to the Paris Climate Agreement, where governments came together for the first time and helped sort of pledge that, okay, we'll commit to certain goals of carbon either removal or reduction. And that means governments, along with companies, had some role to play.
Mhm.
Um, was this an easy mechanism, or did it start privately before and then governments jumped in? Because I believe governments are slow to react, whereas markets or companies, private sector is always kind of faster to adopt to new.
It is. It is. It is. I mean, the governments. I mean, I don't blame the government so much. They were suddenly put in with a massive problem to solve, and
Right.
I don't think everybody thought this through. So Paris Agreement, what it did was like, okay, listen, guys, everybody has to, reduce emissions. Uh, Not just the developed, not just the developing, the whole world has to come together, which I don't mind so much, but I would still be, a bit more understanding of the fact that the global South countries, a lot of them do not have the capacity, and they have a right to grow as well. It is not to develop, to get their people to living wages, to get their people better healthcare facilities, better electrification, better energy needs. So that I don't think was as well thought out. So then the carbon markets again becomes very essential, because why the markets? Because you need to make a business case out of this. you cannot just depend on philanthropy. You cannot just depend on public finance systems or academic institutions to solve this problem. If you don't make a business case out of it, you will not have enough action at scale. You will still have climate action. You will still have these little things that are being done by people, and I commend them for it. I respect them for it, but that's not enough to solve this problem. You
Absolutely.
need large scale solution deployment in terms of different kinds of technologies, different kinds of civil movements, in terms of mobilizations and so on and so forth. That will not happen if private sector is not involved. Innovation, R&D, you will need a lot. Companies are not going to do R&D just for the heck of it, unless they see some kind of a business case for it. And that is what carbon markets does in the large scale. And so that is why I think it became quite essential for the carbon markets to work, even in the era of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement basically says that countries need to cut their emissions. But a lot of countries are like, how? So there is a commitment, but I have no idea how to reach there, because you have to discover costs. There's a financial modeling around it. Again, who's going to pay for it? The countries might have made a commitment in 2016, but in 2020, after COVID, the economies kind of were reeling, right? So then what becomes their priority? Is to meet their climate commitments or to get their economy back up? So that's where I think the carbon markets can play a very, very good role, and actually not Kyoto was one phase of it, Paris and beyond Paris, in my opinion. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So how do these work exactly? Like, it's a market system where if I'm a company and I want to, or a government organization and I want to, um, actually either. So, okay, I think before that, I wanted to ask you also about what is the two types of markets, right? Because there's the offsets and then there's the actual carbon credits. Could you explain that a little bit, and then I can dig into how that actually works?
Okay, so a carbon credit is the essential underlying, let's call it a quantified unit, a carbon credit. A carbon credit is an equivalent of 1 ton of CO2, right? Which
Okay.
is certified under various international standards. These are not just claims that are made randomly. So there are methodologies you can calculate, and then they are certified by certain standards. And then you are holding that unit. Now that unit could be bought, when I say bought or financed, by a company which has a compliance target meaning a country which has put a cap on emissions on a certain sector, and that company says, guys, we are going to not be able to meet that cap, so then I have to buy some carbon credits, which indirectly, when you're buying it, you have financed that decarbonization from that country that you're buying from. So if it's a steel company in India, which has processed its wastewater better or processed its waste heat better and has saved on emissions, then there's a steel plant in UK. They're like they have not met with their cap. They can buy this, and that becomes the compliance market then.
I
Why?
see.
Because that cap is the compliance, but the carbon credit remains the same. Then there is a company there in, say, Silicon Valley, which says, listen, I have a net zero target. What is a net zero target? That my emissions go down to absolute zero, net zero. Whatever I'm emitting, I am actually net at zero. In that case, carbon credits are an essential, because you will never be completely net zero in the world that we live in today, because not everything is as green as we think it is. So that's not going to happen. So you would need essentially carbon credits. But that, when it happens, we now call that a voluntary market, because that company voluntarily took a net zero commitment. So that becomes the voluntary market. And somebody who has to buy that credit to be still in business is called a compliance credit, which could be a cap or an emission. Or, for example, in Singapore, you have to pay a carbon tax. So if you have a limit, if you're not meeting the limit, you will have to pay a tax on it. Or you could buy a carbon credit, which is authorized by the government of Singapore, and you can give that carbon credit in lieu of your taxes. So whichever is cheaper. So it becomes a business decision.
Right.
So all of this is meant for actually businesses to decarbonize. The idea is that put a price on the carbon. Then businesses are incentivized to decarbonize, because not always everybody thinks of the carrot and stick theory. They say you put the stick, everybody will come in. No, it does not happen. During COVID, a lot of businesses went bankrupt. So what are you going to do? You're going to stop them from coming back into business? You cannot do that. So that it has to be a carrot and stick mechanism, which actually helps because you can make a business case out of decarbonizing every ton of carbon. And that is the big way why the carbon credit as a concept is very, very important.
So this is where the government's responsibility lies in setting caps on different industries,
Yeah.
figuring out which are the biggest polluters, emitters of CO2. Does this also work for non-CO2? Because we did an episode just before and we talked about short-lived climate pollutants. So is this only focusing on CO2 emissions? Do we also measure the rest of the...
No, I mean you can. I mean there is currently a market mechanism for short-lived pollutants as well, which is coming up, right? Which for biodiversity.
Mhm.
It has to. For me, any climate action has to be quantified outcome-based funding.
Absolutely.
When I say outcome-based, anything that we do, whether it be short-lived pollutants, whether it be TCO2, whether it be biodiversity, all kinds of financing has to be outcome-based. And for me, the markets are only going to pay you for a product which is basis an outcome, right? Which is why I like this concept.
Mhm.
It is not some abstract concept. This is a quantified unit that is certified, verified by third parties that you're paying for. So the event has happened or is going to happen. You may prepay as well. I mean, there are different structures, but technically this is the best form of outcome-based climate financing that I have seen. Which is quite important, I think, in this whole landscape. And any form of outcome today for that short-lived pollutants, you will have wastewater as a market as well. You will have, I would think, and I'm hoping that all kinds of different kinds of drivers of climate change that we have has
Can
some
be
form
put
of
in.
market mechanism. Absolutely.
Yes, it does sound like the most reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, I'm
Um, so
not
how
the right.
are these things measured? Like what I can imagine it's of course a bit of a complex topic to be explaining in a couple of sentences, but could you give an overview? Does it mean that you kind of actually measure through some equipment the amount of CO2 being emitted or being sequestered?
No, it depends on the project itself. Look, there are 100 over 550 different types of projects. So I'll give you an example, right? For example, um, you're producing power using rice husk. Rice husk is a waste from rice farming, which would ideally be kept on the side of the roads or be burnt. But you could technically take that and put it into a gasifier and make electricity out of it.
Mm.
In which case, otherwise, you would have used coal to make that electricity, so you can get a carbon credit for it, right? Because this is your way for it. Now, this same carbon credit, how is it? So there is a particular methodology which says that, listen, if you use rice husks to produce electricity,
Mhm.
then these are the values and which are basically governed by the IPCC mostly, the International Panel on Climate Change. These are a group of scientists who come up with a lot of different allometric equations and methodologies. So all of these are put into the standard documents, right? So where you can go and say, okay, listen, I am producing this much power using rice husk, so I should get a carbon credit. And this is the methodology and the scientific process via which I am claiming this quantity.
Mhm.
And then there's a third party which will come and actually check if that claim is true or not. And then is when you can go ahead and claim your carbon credit. Now, are you measuring the exact amount of carbon? No, you're measuring the exact amount of husk that went in and how much power you created. Because then you have different kinds of mathematical models that you can input this data into. And these are metered devices, right? So you know exactly because you have a weighing meter, which will give you how much rice husk went in, and you will have another meter which produces how much power you came out of. And these are the two data points basis which you then put it into a carbon model and then you get your carbon count. So it's not that complicated. I mean, scientists have actually worked to make it much more accessible. And this has been ongoing for a very, very long time. So it's different for different kinds of projects. If you're planting a tree as well, you will get a carbon credit. Now you're not measuring the carbon, you're measuring the tree growth, because then you have mathematical models wherein you can put the tree growth into that model and then come up with a carbon count.
I see. That makes sense. Yeah. Um, Depending on different projects, you have ways to sort of measure exactly how much is being either offset or the credit is being given to someone. All right, this much is clear. I think now moving on, what I would like to address is probably the regulatory bodies, because I'm sure there's someone governing all these decisions. Are there any standards? Are there any policies? Are there any global standards, or do they differ from the country's own unique approach to having these markets?
No, as in, look, the markets started off being governed by the UN. I mean, and rightly so. The UNFCCC is how we call it, the UN Climate Change Convention. And I don't know what the F was, but maybe I'm forgetting now. But the UNFCCC is what governed all of the things that worked around the carbon thing. Of course, when the voluntary companies came in, and as I said, so then we had, a WWF-backed standard called Gold Standard, which came in as one of the first voluntary standards, I would assume. And then we had about 4 or 5 of them, including one of the standards called Vera, which is currently used as well. So we have about, I would say about 7 to 8 standards globally.
Oh, there are different. Okay.
There are different standards, yeah, which are governed. I mean, these are the voluntary standards. And then, well, now it's, I think, more than 20 different standards. But all of them need third-party validation and verification. You cannot just claim it just because you like to make a claim, right? And so the UN still stands, and then you have these few standards. So these are all international standards, most of them based of the US and Europe for now. But of course, increasingly governments are going to play a bigger role in setting up standards of their own. I don't necessarily believe in that much, but it's happening, whether we like it or not. I would rather consolidate all standards under one umbrella body, but that's not happening. So yeah, people come up with different standards, different methodology, different ways of calculating carbon. But again, as long as they're peer reviewed and globally accepted, I am okay with that, But yeah, and governments, like you mentioned, Sanika, about the roles, I think there's a very, very important role to play, especially for the bigger economies. Because the bigger economies are becoming very big emitters as well, whether we like it or not. And that is something that I think these governments need to really look at, which are the high emitting sectors, what could be a potential incentive for these sectors to reduce their carbon footprints, because sometimes in 10 years' time, this is going to be unmanageable for a lot of the countries.
Absolutely. So yeah, it does make sense that with future perspective, we have probably one standard. It's just easier for everyone to understand, follow. Just like IPCC is doing it under unified umbrella, maybe that does make sense.
It does. I think we are trying to standardize the voluntary market a little bit on
Right.
the supply side. We have an initiative called the ICVCM, Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, that is looking at the supply side to standardize all of that under one, we call it the core carbon principles, under one principle. So
When
there's
you mean the supply side, it's the supply of the credits.
Credits, yes, the supply side of the credits, sorry. And then you have another initiative called the VCMI, Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, which is looking at the buy side, which is the claim side. So which is at the greenwashing side, let's put it that way. So if there's a company which is selling you a bottle saying this is carbon neutral, is it actually carbon neutral? I mean, and what is the company actually doing towards the decarbonizing before using carbon credits?
Such a vital step, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so VCMI is working on that, saying, guys, have you first tried to reduce? None of us in the carbon market say use carbon credits without reducing first. You reduce what you can, offset what you can't. When you say what you can't, and most people don't understand, saying what can't you reduce? But think about it. Today sustainable aviation fuel is less than 5% of all aviation fuel, but we all fly, right? At some point, we will all fly to our homes. Then what is the reduction that you could have done there? You could not have. The carbon offset world basically says take responsibility for it by paying somebody else's reduction, please, because otherwise your other option is to do nothing. So there is an element of responsibility there. So again, so VCMI is trying to work on that part, saying, guys, you reduce what you can only offset only part of it. But if you don't reduce, then you cannot claim the offset. Then you're not a very good. Then your company isn't very serious about climate change, And
yeah, because then you're just adding to the overhead, and it
exactly.
almost gets into the greenwashing category. Then.
Exactly, which is a very valid argument for carbon markets, saying, yeah, you can just offset your way out, but you cannot actually. There's not a single company which has offset its way out. There's not a single company that can do it and has done it. So
That's
for us,
good to know, because I'm going to come. I'm going to come to the challenges and the critique later. But I think I also want to address what's happening in India, right? Because this podcast, we're trying to figure out climate change and its various facets from an Indian point of view. There's not much information out there. So I thought this could be a great segue into knowing what India's policy is. India recently announced its carbon
Mm.
market initiative.
Mhm.
And under the Securities Exchange Board, we're going to probably come up with a carbon market by 2026. They're claiming that. Now, the veracity of that is yet to be seen. But yeah, tell us what you know about the current situation in India on this.
I mean, listen, I mean, there is going to be a market in 2026. I think that claim is fairly robust. I mean, what the market's going to look like, there are still some moving pieces. I think we're going to have to sort that out. But this is going to be a compliance market, Sanika. Let's be very clear.
Mm.
Of course, there is a voluntary initiatives to start now, but that is for companies to voluntarily act. I'm not so sure Indian corporates are that inclined to act voluntarily, to be honest with you. I think there has to be a compliance element to it, which is what it's going to be interesting because I think India does need compliance markets. And
Right.
I'll tell you why. Because our decarbonization, on the industrial side, especially heavy industries, is has to be incentivized. Because if you look at the corporate side with the margins that they currently have, if there is no incentive to decarbonize, they will not decarbonize.
Mm.
That incentive has to come in the form of carbon markets, in my opinion. Because government subsidies or dolouts are not going to work out in this kind of in this thing. So I don't blame some very hard to abate sectors. There are some sectors which are very hard to reduce emissions. They will need support, and I think a domestic carbon market is essential for allowing that support to happen. So yeah, I'm actually looking forward to this. Actually, in a way, I mean, let's see how much the market picks up in terms of demand. I am worried about demand. In India, we create supply overnight. It's a very
Right,
entrepreneurial.
India is the second largest market right now, right? Supplier of carbon credits.
It
India
is,
is
but
the
it's international
fastest.
supplying internationally. So imagine if there is a domestic demand. Wow, there will be supply overnight. But I'm worried about demand. So let's see how that demand can be
What are the
fulfilled.
main things that are worrisome on that side? Is it the acceptance itself, or is it the monetary cap that is that will be
I
accepted?
think I think I mean there are two things. One is I don't think we're going for a typical cap and trade market. I mean, I think it's more of with a target based approach, and that's a very different reform for compliance markets. But that's quite a complicated subject. Maybe I don't want to get, but Google's all over
Part
the
two
place.
of this episode.
Yeah, maybe because that's very complicated. What is target based? What is cap and trade, and so on and so forth. But let's say compliance. And India compliance takes time. Why does it take time? You may have a law because you have a law, but then the follow up to that takes 2 3 years, 4 years, and in India we have this dekhte hain kind of attitude. Let's say, okay,
Mhm.
guys, let's not do it right away. Let's see what happens. Somebody will go to court. Maybe there'll be a stay order. Who knows?
Mm.
So early mover thing does not happen beyond the top 100 or top 200 BSC or SEBI. So that is where I feel the challenge will be of inaction. And number two is because India becomes such a good supply hub, I will see more sellers than buyers any day. And that will drive down costs. And if it drives down costs, is actually a disincentivizing decarbonization.
To
So
to then
that is
buy. Yeah.
yeah, that is why I am a bit worried. Because immediately you will have a demand and then supply comes in. Once the supply goes up, price goes down. And then actually supply will come down. But that's a cycle that we cannot afford right now. I don't think we need to decarbonize much faster.
Yeah. So you work a lot in this space on life projects that you've been doing for years. What are some of the highlights? Could you like give a few cases that you're really proud of or things that really made sense from an Indian point of view?
I think from an Indian point of view, one thing is, I mean, not just from an Indian point of view, if you're anywhere in the, I hate to use this word again, but global south, anywhere, because you're severely affected by it, and we have two kinds of communities who are severely affected by climate change. One are coastal communities, and number two are farming communities. And in India, we have one of the longest coastlines in Asia, and we have one of the largest agricultural landscapes in Asia. So we are doubly hit, and so my, I wouldn't say proud of, but something that we have been very, very conscious of from the beginning of starting this carbon markets on how we can get the benefits of climate finance directly to the people who are taking climate action. What
Yes.
happens in today's landscape is that governments pay governments, but the
Mm.
governments are not the one who are taking climate action. It's that farmer on the ground.
And their
So I'm
livelihood
like,
is not at stake directly.
exactly. And that for me is where the carbon markets comes in.
Mm.
Put money into the first responders is what I call them. I don't even call them vulnerable because they are the ones who are responding first. During COVID, we used to call our paramedics first responders. In my opinion, that farmer is a first responder, or that person, that fisherman who does not have enough fish anymore in the
So true.
sea is the first responder. The sea levels rising, homes are moving. So for me, I think, and this is not just from our perspective, I think in the markets in general should be quite proud of themselves in a way. I'm not saying that 100% of the market is super squeaky clean. It's not. And nothing's perfect. A lot of our projects, I've never claimed perfection. I mean, we say, guys, the good is good enough for now.
I
So
mean, that is the whole goal in this uh, fight in the
right?
climate space, right? We are evolving as the challenge evolves. And it's always catching up to the problem that we've created 30, 40 years back. So
Exactly.
we
I
are
mean,
trying
there
our
is no,
best with the mechanisms at hand.
and we'll never get it perfect. You know what? So I'm very proud of the fact that when we see our farm federations getting paid,
Mhm.
that is our moment. Today carbon finance enables a significant amount of money for farmers who are practicing agroforestry or regenerative agriculture, organic farming, reducing their irrigation energy use. Different kinds of things that they can do. Coastal federations by planting mangroves, for example. There are different things that are working. I mean, we were working with shrimp farmers who have lost their livelihoods. I'm like, guys, okay, don't grow shrimp, grow mangroves. It's like, okay, but who's going to pay? Saying, guys, here is what happens. So carbon markets don't just pay for the market and the carbon. It pays, especially for countries like India, for adaptation. Because
The carbon
nobody
markets then are at the forefront of a lot of work that can be done on ground, apart
totally,
from the whole nonprofit or the sector that is working towards the adaptation and mitigation. This is
I
actually
completely
direct
agree.
efforts that will get paid out to the people who are getting affected and to the people who are going to be working on them.
Absolutely. For me, that's why I actually call it make markets actually work for adaptation.
Hmm.
Nobody else is paying for this. We work on agroforestry programs. For example, our first job was not to plant trees, but to get bore wells with solar pumps into place, because without water, there is no trees. People have left that ground and moved to the cities to work as urban laborers because there is no cropland to crop anymore because there is no water.
Right.
So a carbon project, once it comes in, it's not just dealing with the carbon itself. You know what? Suddenly this place has water. Now actually farmers can come back. A lot of
Mm.
them are in fact planning to come back in 3, 4 years' time because you would have more fertile, you would have more water. So these are things that are landscape-based approaches, which are not, I don't think they are financeable by just one instrument. You know what I mean? If
Mm.
you blend them together, it all works. Today, that same program is working with the government subsidy program. So then there is a bank which is loaning money to the federations. This is all being enabled because of that one tree planting project. So it cannot be looked at exclusively. And that is something, when I say it's not just us, there are lots of people who are doing this work. I think this is something that we should tell people more about, saying that a carbon credit is not what it's touted to be. Trust me on that. There's a lot of value to be derived from that.
What stops individuals from joining this now? If I decide that, okay, well, I want to start something and be on the supply side, um, how do people get into this?
Yeah, I mean that's the tricky part. So when you come into
Yeah.
challenges on the supply side, I mean, when I said these are all third party audited and verified, right? Those costs are quite, I wouldn't say very high, but it's for individual action, it's very high. But for collective action, it is not very high, and
No,
that's
that
where
makes sense because I think I asked the question in a reverse way. What I wanted to know was, there have to be some gatekeeping mechanisms because otherwise it's just going to be another.
Otherwise, it's just going to be somebody waking up in the morning and said, I want a carbon credit because
Exactly.
whatever, I mean, so no, that's not going to happen. But I wish there could be a world where we could have more individual, supply side action. But that is not the world we have currently, Kanika. It's more of a collective action
Mhm.
because of this exact transaction reason. But that gatekeeping is very, very important.
Right. So that's good to know. Summing up a little bit, we know about what the markets are. There's compliance, there's voluntary. In India, currently, we are going towards the compliance market. There are regulatory bodies that actually are the gatekeepers of this entire process. Now, I've been hearing a lot of critique about this, and you know this because last year we spoke about exactly these topics. I want to delve in and get your 2 cents on this because it's a sensitive topic. A lot of people are polarized on, oh no, carbon markets are entirely disgraceful, and some people are like us. We actually believe that these are the only ways in which we can continue the fight while we have a perfect someday a perfect solution.
No, I mean, I would reterm that as we're not the only solution, we're just one of the solutions, but we are a very important one. What disappoints me about the critique is, look, the critique is on two sides. For me, essentially, if I break down the critiquing, it's on the accounting system and it's on the transparency system. So, in my opinion, these are the two things that you can critique the carbon markets on, right? And transparency is both on financial transparency on the supply side as well as the claim transparency on the buy side.
Right.
So that's the transparency. And number two is how are you accounting for the carbon credit? What disappoints me, and this is something I get a lot of critique, and we would get a lot of critiquing even back in the day, but mostly from the North American, European kind of a world, where they say, yeah, but our company is paying for something there. I don't know how this fits. Maybe they should just reduce emissions here. And I kept telling them that, listen, guys, global warming is not an EU problem or a US problem. It is a problem. That's why we call it global.
Yeah.
So your reduction is going to cost 10 times more than my reduction here in India. I think from a global warming perspective, just the economic argument of it, you will get 10 times more results here. This is why you should be funding it. Because we have a global CO2 problem. It's not yours or mine. So and of course, you reduce what you can. We always say reduce what you can, offset what you can't. And that's how the whole market came in. So but that's something we were used to. I think what the disappointment is, I think even the global South people suddenly have kind of started critiquing this. And for me, this is a big surprise because this is the only form of finance that gets really into the bodies or community bodies that we have in the region. So that is what disappoints me. And I would like to tell them that, listen, this is not about greenwashing. No company in the world or nobody in his right sense of the word has ever said that you can offset your way out of climate change trouble. No, you cannot. Here, you're only taking responsibility for something you cannot reduce.
Right.
And that, for me, is a question of responsibility. It's not a question of compensation. The way it's been narrated is being compensatory. It is not compensatory in my book. It is taking responsibility for something that needs to be done. And you as a global North organization, or for that matter, even a global South organization, today, Indian companies should be also getting into the carbon markets big time because they have a responsibility as well.
I mean, anyone who produces the emissions ought to take responsibility.
Ought to take responsibility. So this is a responsibility discussion. It is not a compensatory and a greenwashing discussion as it has been made out to be. I was expecting this mostly from constituents outside of our countries, but to have that in our countries, I don't understand this. I'm like, guys, who else takes responsibility? We continually go out to the UN demanding climate finance from developed countries. Here, this is exactly what's going on. So
I was surprised as well because last COP, the entire discussion mostly surrounded topics of compensation, of financing, and the whole transition to
we actually lobby for just transition. In my opinion, carbon markets is one form of finance which is actually enabling the just transition. You're asking a farmer to go to organic. Why will he or she do it? Absolutely. There is a market premium to it. If carbon pays for it, you have funded the transition.
Mm.
And that is what it ends up with, because right now there is no government in the world which pays you the transition fee. So then where do you go? So this is what I don't understand. Yes, nothing's right, perfect about the carbon market. I'm not saying, when I say, guys, I've reduced this many tons, is this with 120% accuracy? No,
Yeah.
it's with at 80% accuracy. And I'm being honest about it. I'm like, yeah, I don't have all of this right, but is that 80% is super important in this world today.
Transparency and honesty mechanism, or not the mechanism, it's just the way
Is the
how this
way.
should work, is very crucial at this point because it allows you to have honest conversations that these are the places where there are challenges, but we're working on it. But these are the places where we're honestly telling about what solutions have worked. And I think that is
Yeah,
the
I
box.
mean, just honesty. I think there needs to be a space for the discourse and the honesty. But this is a continuous improvement process. None of us have got it perfect. We've never claimed this is perfect. So why are we being brickbatted for something that we've never claimed before? And that is something that I really, really, and especially from the Global South organizations. And I have been breaking my head and everything else, trying to explain to people why this is so important for
Mm,
our, especially in from the context of India, the biggest sufferers are coastal communities and farming communities. There is no other mechanism, climate finance mechanism, that pays for them right now. It's as simple as that. I actually have no doubts about
true. Speaking of companies or governments critiquing or taking responsibility, Google recently did this whole big announcement of ending its mass purchase of cheap carbon offsets. I'm wondering what this has an implication on for the rest of big companies and people who are working in this field but might be sort of getting cold feet because of this announcement.
Yeah, they might be, and they will be, and which is quite disappointing as well. I think there should be more companies now acting on carbon, but the reality is that I think only the more evolved ones are going to do it, and the less evolved ones are not going to do it, which is quite unfortunate. Yeah, so you are right. It is having an impact, and I think it's not the best thing in the world, to be honest with you. But I think this has been partly fueled by Global South reporting and media at large not understanding this whole concept as much as they should have, to be honest with you. Because Google can get away with saying something like that. There have been companies which have just dumped their SBTi targets. We do
Mm,
not see any reporting on that in the Global South media. For me, that's a big, big red flag.
mhm.
So pick on a story which is critiquing your carbon markets much faster than you pick on a story which is actually killing climate change action from private sector. It just doesn't make sense to me, and that's something we should be more worried about as well. So
I
yes, I think more pressure on global, and I don't want to make this about global south, global north, to be honest. It's about high emitting companies versus communities who are on the front lines. That's about it. You know, and if we don't put that pressure on them to act, then this is a get out of jail card. In fact, that is more greenwashing, in my opinion. You
mm,
know, and so that is where I think we really need to come together to understand that this is not a perfect market, and there are bad apples everywhere. I mean, you'll have people scamming the system in, well, everywhere. In stock markets, there are scammers as well. You don't stop a market just because there are one or two scams. You try and work with it. And for me, this is where I think the world needs to start talking a bit more about this as a solution, and first acknowledging this as a solution, because otherwise it's just a few of us here, right, who keep talking
absolutely.
about it. It's unfair, I think. But yeah, to be honest with you, yes, what Google or anybody else is, and I think there will be a few more announcements. It's
There
not going
are,
to be.
yeah, yeah. My biggest question is with tech companies, AI, or say blockchain, or all of these new technologies are the largest emitters because they are using so much energy, they're actually polluting so much more. And at the same time, the flip side of that coin is these technologies can also help in this fight because I'd like to know more on the monitoring side of things, right? How do satellite technologies or AI can help address the challenges that are existing in the carbon markets?
Yeah, I mean, look, listen, the challenges in the carbon markets. I mean, today, the carbon markets, first of all, and I think this is something I say everywhere. The carbon market is a lot more than just planting trees or saving trees. You
Mm-hmm.
know, the carbon markets is, in my opinion, back from when I started, was also about energy efficiency. was also about energy efficiency in SME industries. For example, unorganized sector today is one of the highest emitters that you have.
Mm.
Carbon markets can help them, right? And there you don't need the high-end AI technology. You need a meter, and that's about it.
Right.
So in my opinion, we are ignoring that side of the markets completely, which we should not be doing.
Simple
Then,
solutions.
yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's a clear carbon avoidance there, right? If you reduced energy consumption from 100 megawatt hours to 50 megawatt hours, that's clear. There is no questions around it, right? It's not about whether that tree actually grew or not. There's no monitoring there. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's a metered monitor, so there's no problem there, So put it in a digital platform and there you are. So one is that. So I think DMRV solutions of the nature that you mentioned, AI blockchains, is good for the land use space.
Mhm.
I think in 5 years' time, I say 5 years with a lot of responsibility because I don't think everything's out there in terms of technology as yet. But
Right.
in 5 years' time, it's going to be much easier monitoring all of these activities using AI, satellites, blockchain to some extent for the data transparency part of it. So I really think that world is coming, and it's already started, and I think that's a good thing. And as to whether they're energy intensive or not, but that's the trade-off, right? So nothing's black and white anymore, right? When people say, yeah, but if you're buying carbon credits, that means you're greenwashing. No, because that company may not be able to do anything more, and
Mhm.
nobody's looking at that scenario, and which is a very, very important and logical scenario to look at, So that's the trade-off. So we are trying to make a just transition happen in a world full of these trade-offs, which is why carbon markets is the only way to balance that entire mismatch that we have.
Right. Yeah. Sandeep, what are some of the forthcoming trends that you see give you hope?
Okay. I see a lot of
I don't
financial.
just want to, so, I'm sorry. I don't want to
No,
just ask on the trends part, but also on the policy front, right? Because that goes hand in hand with what is going to affect the market.
yeah, possibly. I mean, I think absolutely you're right. I think governments are waking up to this a lot more, which is a very good trend. Technology is picking up. Like I said, in 5 years' time, I think we'll have amazing technology and land use programs. Um, financial, the financial world is also looking at this very closely,
Hmm.
and I think that's a good thing. It still remains to be seen how they will engage with the markets, but it is something that a lot of people, especially in our circles, we keep meeting a lot of people and talking about it. So I think the three big trends are technology, finance, and regulation. And I think these trends are important, but it's moving in the right direction, in my opinion. Um, so yeah, for me, these are the big three hopes that I have, and another big hope, which I hope is that more people get a little bit more involved in these discussions and then just brush them off as carbon offsetting. These carbon market guys. I'm like, no, this is a real solution. Please give it some time and understand it a little bit more. And don't go by what's out there as a narrative. It's not the actual narrative.
Yeah, this is why I listen to this podcast, try and educate and understand what carbon
Absolutely, it is.
markets are. And I usually like to end the podcasts by bringing the conversation back to what individuals can do, what their role is, right? Because, of course, in the end, we tend to get overwhelmed by all of what's out there. And sometimes it helps to just know if I'm interested in this, what can I do? Where should I start? If carbon markets is something that is interesting to people who are listening to this, what should they do?
Well, firstly, deep dive a little bit about carbon markets and how the markets quantify carbon. Because a lot of you seem to assume that we just randomly come with a number out there and people give us carbon credits for it and we sell it, and that's how it works. But that's not how it works. It's actually a very complicated process. I'm not saying it should be complicated, but it is right now. And I think understanding that process, and I'm not saying get into the science of it, just understand that process, on what are the checks and balances and what are the regulations around that. And number two is, for me, individual action is pressurizing policy and corporate action. Go to your companies and tell companies and continually tell them to make cleaner products, because we are almost asked, a company makes a plastic bottle and then says, oh, but if you're responsible, you'll recycle it. It's like, why aren't you making bottles that don't need to be?
Yeah.
So I think from a I don't like putting too much guilt on the private action side. I'm like, guys, it's for the businesses to take care of this. And that is where I think individual action does come in. So, and carbon markets is part of this entire thing, because if we put enough pressure out there in terms of our policymakers to put pressure on businesses, then guys, this cannot continue. And this cannot continue. Why? Because our businesses have been falling behind that, oh, we didn't create this problem. But we are in the middle of the problem right now, so and we are the third largest emitter right now, if I'm not mistaken. So it's like it's no longer your problem or my problem. It is at our doorstep. So I think our individual action needs to influence policy and action at scale at the local level. It's very, very, very important right now.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. This was very, very insightful, mainly because we simplified it to the maximum that can be possible. So thank you for an enlightening discussion. And everyone, if you're interested in knowing more, please go follow VNV Advisory, go talk to Sandeep. And yeah, let's have that understanding that carbon markets is a thing out there. India is introducing this soon, and it's going to be part of our lives. So yeah.
Thanks, Anika.